that I confronted some things in my own life, some sources of self-loathing that I'd never really looked at carefully before. But then as I was writing them through, I had to really examine them and see them also not only from my own eyes of a kind of driven by suicidal self-loathing, but imagining how they might be viewed by others. And when you sort of take a look at yourself from that external perspective, you start seeing some of these things a little bit differently, I think. I always tell my students and anyone who comes to me in crisis, imagine if the people that you are surrounded by are going around with these same terrible feelings of self-loathing that you have. You can see about them that they're good people whose lives are important and that they should stick around and that you don't want them to take their own lives. Maybe you could have that same recognition about yourself.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, and today we're confronting a difficult and often taboo subject, suicide. Somewhere in the world, a person dies by suicide every 40 seconds. And after a pandemic lull, suicide rates are rising again in the United States. And it's not just amongst middle-aged white men. According to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, suicide rates for youth have been on the rise in the US for the past 15 years. Today, it's the third leading cause of death for kids aged 10 to 19, and the second for young adults aged 20 to 24. The largest increase in the rate of suicide has occurred amongst males aged 15 to 24, and it disproportionately affects Black children and those who identify as LGBTQ. So what is going on? And it's not just in America, but it's elsewhere in the world. So today's forum is hopefully not to get us to throw our hands up in despair, but instead to help dispel some of the myths about suicide and also to provide some advice about recognizing worrisome symptoms in a friend or loved one, and thus help us make a serious effort to remedy some of these lost lives. We're very fortunate to have two wonderful experts in the field today. Clancy Martin is a professor of philosophy at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. He's an acclaimed author of numerous books on philosophy, including translations of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. His most recent book is very different. It's a memoir, How Not to Kill Yourself. It's a portrait of his own suicidal mind and his many attempts to end his life. Joining us from Scotland, we have Professor Rory O'Connor. He's a health psychologist at the University of Glasgow, where he leads the Suicide Behaviour Research Lab. He's also the president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention. He's published extensively in the field of suicide prevention and self-harm and has contributed to 6 BBC documentaries on the topic, including Suicide and Me. His latest book is When It Is Darkest: Why People Die by Suicide and What We Can Do to Prevent It. It covers his 25 years working as a world leader in this field. So welcome to you both, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks you so much.
Delighted to be here.
So apart from coming from two very different continents, I'm very grateful for you, Rory, staying up so late. You share some similar insights about suicide, and then you share some very unlikely differences in your lives. You're very, very, very different, your life experiences. So let's begin with you, Clancy. This book was a dramatic departure from your prior textbooks on philosophy. And in it, you decided to reveal some of your innermost secrets by telling your family, you have 5 children, your students, and the world at large, that you had in fact attempted to end your life multiple times, beginning, I think, at the age of 6 or something like that. However, in exposing the demons, you also admitted to being, quote, very grateful that I am incompetent at killing myself. And I believe that almost every suicide can be prevented, including my own, with access to good behavioral health systems. So tell me, what was the purpose in writing this very brave book?
Well, thank you so much for your extremely kind description of it and my work. Really, what happened was about 5 or 6 years ago, I was working on an essay with an editor about some time I'd spent in psychiatric hospitals. And at that time, someone he loved attempted suicide. And he said, I noticed, Clancy, that every time you've been in the psychiatric hospital, it's been for the same reason, which is that you've tried to take your life. And I said, yeah, that's true. And he said, do you think you could shift your focus a bit towards your suicide attempts rather than just the problems you've run into in psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric care? And I said, yeah, of course. And when that piece came out, I started getting emails from all over the world of people saying roughly the same thing. I was Googling how to kill myself, and your piece came up, and I decided not to take my own life, not to make an attempt. And when you get emails like that as a philosophy professor or as a writer, it's not the sort of thing you really ever expect to have happen in your life, when suddenly people are reaching out to you and saying, oh my goodness, your story has saved my life, and it makes a big impact on you. And I realized that I had only told a little part of the story, and that it might be helpful to people to tell the whole story. And so that's what I did. And it turned out that the person that helped most of all was me. And it had this profound effect, writing this book, on my own suicidal ideation, which had continued all the way up to about 6 months or so ago. I was still in a daily way wrestling with the urgent thought of trying to take my own life. And shortly before and then following the book coming out, it's amazing, frankly, to report, but this thought has just seemed to be dispelling. It still occurs to me, but not with the old teeth that it had and the old pull that it had. Now it occurs to me, and I can just sort of see it there and let it go.
So you kind of exorcised it by going public.
I think that's, yeah, surely part of what happened. And I think part of it also may be that I confronted some things in my own life, some sources of self-loathing that I'd never really looked at carefully before. But then as I was writing them through, I had to really examine them and see them also not only from my own eyes of a kind of driven by suicidal self-loathing, but imagining how they might be viewed by others. And when you sort of take a look at yourself from that external perspective, you start seeing some of these things a little bit differently, I think. I always tell my students and anyone who comes to me in crisis, imagine if the people that you are surrounded by are going around with these same terrible feelings of self-loathing that you have. You can see about them that they're good people whose lives are important and that they should stick around, and that you don't want them to take their own lives. Maybe you could have that same recognition about yourself, that you too are important and your life is worth saving, and you can be a force for good in the world. And so that may have been part of it as well.
So you had a history of suicides in your immediate family growing up, and you said you still live in this kind of perpetual ambivalent state from day to day, and these incompatible ideas occupy almost equal space. Well, you just answered that and said that balance has shifted. So how have you managed this daily battle, along with this history of dealing with alcoholism, so that now you feel in a better place?
Well, I think for me, what had to happen is I had to recognize that I had developed a pattern of thought over the course of many years that suicide was a good idea. And how one changes a pattern of thought, habitual pattern of thinking, addictive thinking, is notoriously complicated and difficult thing to do, as we all know. Liberating yourself from any addiction is so hard. And I had become addicted to this thought of suicide. But how it came to happen, I think, was recognizing, making the shift from thinking that suicide was a good thing to thinking that suicide was a bad thing, and also developing kind of a list of strategies so that when I was in a bad place, I had ways I could deal with the fight or flight, the panicky feeling that characterizes, I think, so many people's feelings right before an attempt.
Well, we're going to get to those in a little bit from both of you. I think they're very important. You said you wanted to dispel some misconceptions in the book about what a suicidal person looks like. And you yourself said it's not just this narcissistic, sort of selfish person, as I actually thought. I'm quoting you now, and many others presume this person. So what do you say to that? And also, what do you say to the students in your philosophy class about the profile of this suicidal person?
Well, the first thing that I want people to know is that if you've had someone in your life die by suicide, you should not be blaming yourself for that. Probably you are one of the reasons that person stayed around for as long as they did. They were probably fighting the thought of suicide for years, and it was thanks to you and other loved ones around them that they managed to delay their death by suicide for as long as they did. So that's the first thing. Don't blame yourself if you have someone in your life who's died by suicide. You aren't to blame. The second thing I want to say is that we see people take their own lives in every, from every walk of life. You see people take their own lives. And when someone like Anthony Bourdain takes his own life and we think he's got everything going for him, if only I had a life like Anthony Bourdain, I would have no problems. We tend to think, well, no. Once we actually take a close look at the life of Anthony Bourdain, we realize he was struggling with the thought of suicide and suicidal behaviors, what we sometimes call parasuicidal behaviors, ways of sort of killing yourself slowly. We sometimes also refer to these as deaths of despair. He'd been struggling with this for years. And so it's important when you're thinking about people around you to recognize that anyone you may know lots of you surely do know lots of people who struggle with the thought of suicide, but that doesn't mean that they have disclosed this to you or ever reached out to you. They could be completely surprised and unexpected people. And then what sort of follows from that, and is so important, and I know Rory can speak to this more intelligently than I can, is that there should be no shame, no stigma, no self-accusation directed at oneself because of having these suicidal thoughts, and especially not for those who have made an attempt. I know for me, the fact that I had tried to kill myself was such a source of shame and self-reproach, which further exacerbated my self-loathing and made it that much more likely that I would make another attempt. And that's a real shame. The thing, what I sometimes call one of the paradoxes of suicidal thinking, is you can get yourself into a place where you think that you are so ashamed of the fact that you are willing to do this thing that you consider to be such a selfish thing, taking your own life, that you think this is further proof of the fact that you should take your own life because you are such a selfish person who would be willing to take his own life despite being surrounded by people who need you. This proves that you are actually doing more harm to those people than good, and you should in fact remove yourself from their lives, and and they'd all be better off without you. That's how paradoxical and self-punishing the suicidal mind can get. And I indeed did hold that belief for many, many years. I was sure that the people who loved me would be much better off without me, including my own children. And so if you are feeling that way, let me tell you, you're mistaken in that view. They are not better off without you. They want you around. And don't be ashamed of the way you are feeling. It's so many people feel that way. The World Health Organization that estimates that 10% of the world population suffers from suicidal ideation. And that statistic is surely low because of the stigma and taboo that surround the desire and to take one's own life, and of course, making an attempt. And that gives us 700, 800 million people in the world who are thinking about taking their own lives. And if we recognize that the statistic is low, maybe more than 1 billion people, you're suffering from a very common problem, and don't be ashamed of it.
So, Rory, let's move over to you. Your book, When It Is Darkest, is quite an amazing combination of its personal, your revelations about your own life, and full of research. And you mentioned that you'd been bereaved twice by suicide. And I think the longer we live, the more this is inevitable for all of us, sadly. But you make a point of saying that the actual impact of that suicide is like a social bomb exploding. And the devastation isn't just 6 people, which I don't know how that came up. Maybe you can explain it. You said it's more like 135. Mm-hmm. The ripple effect will be huge. So tell us about how you dealt with that grief and a bit about that knock-on effect.
Sure, Mary. But before I do, though, just a couple of words, just listen to Clancy, and obviously, and he probably doesn't like the fact the book's described as brave, because but it is a really impressive synthesis of your own personal experiences, Clancy, but also how you weave in the sort of historical, philosophical perspectives with modern day stuff. I think there's a lot. I mean, it really is. It's a really powerful read. So thank you so much for writing it. So and just you speaking there, so much of it resonates with stuff which is in my book and the work that we've been doing for the last 25, 30 years. And we'll come back to, I think, the patterns of thinking which characterize the suicidal mind. And this idea, and we will talk about the myths around suicide being selfish, but it clearly isn't a selfish act. And something I often try and make very clear when I'm giving talks like this or discourse like this, that although, as Clancy said, it's to the individual often, or to the outside world, it can seem like a selfish act. But what we always have to bear in mind is the unbearable mental pain that people are suffering, and actually that they think the opposite, that they think it's an altruistic act often, and that those around them will feel less, will be relieved if they're no longer there. And Clancy really eloquently put, that's just not the case. That our mind, the suicidal mind, plays games with us, and there's lots of evidence, psychological and other evidence, which we can come back to on that. So I just thought that was useful to say that, Mary, before I go and answer your question directly. So if we look at when I got into the field of suicide research and suicide prevention, whatever, it's now probably 28, 29 years ago, there was this very famous statistic which was coined, I think, by a guy called Edwin Schneidman, who was the founding father of suicide prevention in the United States, set up the American Association for Suicidology, founded the first suicide prevention center in Los Angeles. And he did he did a lot of work in terms of the psychology of suicide. But I think he was the person who first came up with this idea of, for every person who dies by suicide, and he's based on his clinical experience, there's about 6 people affected. But then more recently, we've always sort of known that wasn't grounded in empirical evidence. And then more recently, I think it was in 2018 or 17-18, Julie Carell, a clinical psychologist in Kentucky, she did this survey with colleagues. And basically what she estimated was that for every person who dies by suicide, on average, up to 135 people may know that person, be exposed to that suicide, and potentially affected. Now, of course, the overwhelming majority of those people will not be bereaved in the traditional sense of those close to the individual. But the thing that we should always bear in mind is that none of us can ever predict the impact of a single suicide on those around them. And so over the years, the number of people that I've come across who somebody distant in their work context or somebody distant in their friendship context died by suicide. And that really was like a social bomb going off for them. And for many of them, it could be a case of when a suicide occurs. So what it does is, obviously, when we try and process that as individuals, none of us know what's going on. As Clancy said, so whatever the estimates are, whatever the World Health Organization, 10% of people having suicidal thoughts. So we don't know that for any person who is exposed to suicide, that could just make them feel really vulnerable and recognize that it shines a light on their own vulnerability, their own suicidal thoughts, or it could be that they themselves have been bereaved by suicide. And so it's really important when we look at the ripples of suicide, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations, is that suicide affects everybody and anybody. And again, there's no stereotypical face of somebody who's suicidal. It could be any one of us. And similarly, those who are affected by it, the effect can be devastating as the ripples continue to whatever cascade out. And yes, in my book, what I tried to do, I wrote this book over during COVID, and what I tried to do was, and when it's darkest, is synthesize the work that I've been doing at that stage for 25 years of doing research in the field of suicide and been involved in a lot of policy and advocacy work, but also to acknowledge that, yeah, so when I think about my work over the last 25 years, yes, the research is important, but what's probably more important has been my own direct experience of suicide. And so when I first started research in the field, I wasn't directly affected. I hadn't lost somebody close to me but to suicide. But the sad reality is, and as Clancy said, the numbers of people as we get on, and you said, Mary, as we get older, all of us will know somebody at some stage who's died by suicide. But for me, it's been particularly poignant because one of the two people who were really close to me who died by suicide was the person who brought me into the field of suicide research and suicide prevention. And so one day in the summer of 1994, I got a call from Noel, who basically saying to me, who was a professor in my department, saying there's a possibility of doing a PhD on suicide. And I jumped at the chance. I've been previously doing work on depression. And then little did I know that some years later, he would lose his own struggle and end his life. And I often think back to why did they ask me, why did that happen? And that sort of role of serendipity. And also then one of my closest friends I worked with and I did my PhD with, Claire, and I talk a lot about Claire in the book, and she lost her fight to live in 2008. And those two experiences just devastated me. Claire's in particular, because I was really close to Claire. She was very close to my family. And it was just devastating. It remains devastating. It remains devastating. I think that's the thing for us to remember is that I'm speaking as a friend and a colleague who's lost somebody to suicide. Imagine the devastation for family members and loved ones. It's really, really important that we have these conversations, and crucially, we provide support to those who are bereaved, as well as, of course, those who are struggling with thoughts of suicide.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a difficult question now, before we get on to the myths about suicide, which we're going to pull up from your book. The question is, you were becoming, at that point, an expert, or were you early on in your field when Claire took her life?
Oh, I was the so-called expert by then.
Okay. So did she manifest any of the kinds of behaviors, or when she spoke, did she give you any idea that she was in this dark place?
Yeah, we had conversations.
Okay.
We had conversations, and I talk about this in the book when I reflect on what and the guilt that I still feel, and that was when I got the call from her husband to say she had died. The guilt was just immediate. So that I'd let them down and I'd let Claire down, and that's still there. That's still there. But you just move forward day by day, and it's different now. But at the time, then, yeah, I mean, I've asked myself these questions all the time, but for me, and Clancy said this already, and I write this in my book as well, is nobody can be held responsible for the act of another individual. We can't, and there's so many complex set of factors at play, and our ability to predict suicide is so notoriously difficult. We're no better than the tossing of a coin at predicting suicide statistically, but that shouldn't stop us trying to ameliorate risk and keep as many people safe as possible. I suppose one last thing I suppose I would say in it, Mary, is I suppose what it brought back to me also was the real challenge we have, the real challenge. And so again, I write about this so I was meant to be this so-called expert, and how could I not have prevented their deaths, and what could I have done differently? And actually, in the weeks and months after Claire's death, and so she died in Paris, and I flew out to be with her husband and to try and help get her back to the UK. And those, I just didn't know if I could continue working in the field of suicide research or suicide prevention, because so for me, every single day since 1994 almost, I've been thinking about why people kill themselves and what I can do. And so there's no escape for me in that sense. And it took me a while to reconcile that, to make a decision, whatever way I made it, that could I continue or could I not? And thankfully, I think Claire would have liked me to continue, and I was able to continue.
Well, it's very good for thousands of people around the world that you did. I mean, I could ask you another question, but I think we should follow with what we were talking about, which is the myths about suicide. Perhaps we could pull up the slide from Rory's book. So maybe you could talk us through, this is a very helpful list about some of the myths about suicide.
Okay, so we probably don't have time to go through them all. So I'll maybe just highlight 2 or 3, which I think are really important, especially in this context, actually. So maybe if I'll say something about myth number 4. Clancy's really made the point about myth number 5, about suicidal people clearly wanting to die. That's just not true. Ambivalence is a characteristic so commonly associated with the mind of somebody who's suicidal, between wanting to live and wanting to die. We often hate versus love, and these complexity. I think you talked about the paradoxes, Clancy, and it's indeed, I suppose that one, I don't quite see it as a paradox. I just see it as there are these competing motives in all of us, the sort of fundamental wish to live versus a fundamental wish to die. And I think obviously at times when suicidal thoughts are so intense that the wish to die outweighs the wish to live. But maybe I'll just say something about number 4 first, and then because I think it's a really important one. And so again, when I started out in this field in the 1990s, we still were of the belief that if you ask somebody whether they were suicidal, it would plant the idea in their head. And actually you still hear that today. And actually these 14 myths, which are in the book, I first gave my first public lecture I ever gave in Belfast in Northern Ireland, because although I live in Scotland, I am Irish. And the first talk I gave in Belfast, public audience, I had this slide with these 14 myths. And then when I was writing the book during COVID, whatever many, many years later, I revisited this slide. And actually, it was quite depressing on one level, because what it became to be very clear is these 14 myths all persist today as they did 20, 25 years ago, but they're less common. So I think that's the glint of light that I take from that. But then, so number 4, there's no evidence at all that it plants the idea in someone's head. Indeed, there's evidence for the opposite. So Matty Gould, who's a really good pal in the United States at Columbia in the US, Matty's done work on this, and Matty was the first person to show that actually asking somebody these questions can actually be the start of a life-saving conversation. And people who are asked that question are more likely to get the help and support that they need. So I would encourage anybody on this Zoom tonight, if you're concerned about somebody around you, please just ask them directly. Just ask them directly, are you feeling suicidal? Don't use euphemisms, just be direct. And as long as you're compassionate and show a sense of common humanity and non-judgmental and validate how they're feeling, that must be difficult for you. If the answer is yes, you're not going to do any harm.
I'm sorry, that person will be so relieved and so grateful that you have been honest with them and just honestly asked them this question. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Rory.
Great, Clancy. I was hoping you to pitch in there. so maybe do another, and we can do a double act again. So I'll say my bit, and then Clancy can add his as well. So Number 8, suicidal behavior is motivated by attention seeking. I think that's an important one again, because it speaks to a point that Clancy made earlier about stigma, and that we need to try and smash the stigma around suicide and suicidal behavior. And too often you still hear that if somebody engaged in suicidal behavior but didn't die, it must have been, it was only attention seeking. And it's usually prefaced with only attention seeking. Now, I totally agree that what the person's trying to do is draw attention to their pain. And often they can't see any other way of managing that pain or of communicating that pain. But it's not about attention seeking in the pejorative way that we tend to describe it. It's about attention needing. And I think that's what's much more important. Over to you, Clancy.
Well, I just wanted to, first of all, completely agree with that. I still hear from people, even since this book has been published, people write to me, mostly parents, saying, you know, could you help our child is in this situation, is suicidal, and we don't know whether her suicidal threats are just attention seeking or if we should take them seriously. And it amazes me that we haven't done a better job of educating people that the best predictor of a suicide attempt is someone saying, I am thinking about suicide. You know, it's so common sense, and yet people still don't understand it. And unfortunately, the best predictor of a death by suicide is someone making a suicide attempt. So there's a clear line here. When someone reaches out and says, I'm worried about myself, I'm thinking about harming myself, this is not attention-seeking behavior. It's a cry for help in the cri de coeur sense. They're in acute mental pain, and they're reaching out and they're saying, I really need some help. Please help me. And if you can, as Rory says, so important not to judge this person, not to try to solve this person's problems, not to tell them that suicide is right or wrong, but rather just to listen to them with an open and compassionate heart, and you can save that person's life. And it's, you know, as Rory has been by implication teaching us over the past few minutes, one of, if not the best medicine we know of, and Edwin Schneidman insisted on this as well, medicines we know of for treating suicidal ideation and reducing the likelihood of a suicide attempt is just talking with another human being who will listen to you and cares to listen to you with compassion. So I have a friend. He's one of perhaps the world's preeminent translator of Sanskrit literature. And he said to me when he read my book, he said, I'm so glad to read this because I know when I attempted suicide, people say, oh, it's just an attempt to get attention. But when I woke up in the hospital, I wasn't relieved that I had survived. I was absolutely gutted that I had survived. And this is the experience of so many people who attempt suicide, where you wake up and you're not relieved to have lived. You feel like you wish you had succeeded. So if someone reaches out to you, please take them seriously. And if you're feeling that way yourself, you know, it's hard sometimes to reach out. But if you reach out to a person and they don't respond, reach out to someone else. There's been times when I was feeling suicidal and the only person I could text was my roofer. And I texted him and I said, I'm having a really lousy day. How's your day going? And he texted me back and he said, hey, tell me more about why you're having a lousy day. And just that much lightened the pressure, it eased the pain, it removed the blinders, and I was able to transition out of that moment of crisis.
No, maybe just to touch on a couple of things you just said there, Clancy, and what struck me as you were speaking is one was that last point about reaching out, the roofer example. It's and again, a number of times over the years, I've heard similar sorts of stories of that those what seemingly small connections can be life-saving. No, and so those of you maybe who haven't been suicidal and you're trying to understand maybe supporting somebody who is suicidal, it's really important to remember that suicidal thoughts are not permanent. They come in waves of intensity. And that sort of pattern of suicidal thinking is unique to everybody who has suicidal thoughts. But what we do know is in that peak of high intensity, if somebody maybe reached out or connected towards you, or you get a sense of something that basically interrupted those suicidal thoughts or disrupted those suicidal thoughts, that's genuinely life-saving stuff. And again, I talk a lot about this in my book, about people I've met along my journey who have somebody's just smiled at them, and they felt a sense of worthlessness or worthiness when they were feeling worthless. Because remember, so many people who are suicidal, that rock bottom self-esteem, feel worthless, and actually that nobody would care if they lived or died. So that those small sort of glimpses of light in the darkness is so important. And that's where the title of my book comes from. That's when it's darkest, and we're trying to help people when it's darkest. And in terms of the other bit you mentioned about, Clancy, about the suicidal thoughts, what was the point you made about the I think it's just left my mind now. What you made a point about suicidal thoughts being not the linked to, I've just gone entirely. It was not linked to the suicidal behavior. You said the point about past suicide attempts is a single best predictor of future death by suicide. Sadly, you made that point. Oh yeah, the bit about suicidal thoughts, people disclosing suicidal thoughts. Again, too often there's this myth that if somebody tells you they're suicidal, that means they're not serious. That's utterly untrue, and it's a myth. And the point is that think about how difficult it must have been for somebody to say that, to reach out. So take every utterance of suicide seriously, and every sort of act of self-harm or self-injury seriously, because again, that person is in need of help and support.
One thing
we've lost the slide thing. Is that for a reason?
Yeah, well, because we're getting a lot of questions coming in.
All right.
I've hopped off of some of the things you've said and deluged, really. Partly it's to do with who gets predisposed to suicidal behavior. And someone said, does knowing someone who successfully committed suicide statistically increase the risk? And then somebody else has said, cyberbullying has been tapped as a critical risk factor in teen suicide. Yet my teens assure me that their private online communities, which often have disturbing names like Discord, are a primary source of daily dialogue and support for them. Communities which their parents know little or nothing about. How can we as parents, mentors, or caregivers expose negative and potentially psychological damaging influences when we aren't allowed in behind the curtain? Okay, that's a lot.
Who wants to, do you want to kick off on that, Clancy? I'm happy to, up to you. I don't mind.
I'll take the second question if it's okay with you, Rory, and then you could take the first. And if you have more to say, I did want also to quickly say about and what you said about a smile. I can't, I'm so grateful to you for saying this, because I sometimes worry. I always give people this advice, and I sometimes worry it's a little corny, but I think it's so important. If you're thinking about suicide, you know, the door is always open, as the Stoics said. You can always do it tomorrow. So put it off for just a day.
Yeah.
Go for a walk. And then there's one other thing that I always encourage everyone to do, and I would like to encourage you to do if you're listening to this now and you're having these kinds of thoughts. Give someone, as you're out on that walk, give someone a smile who isn't expecting a smile. And when you do that, if you smile at someone, even though maybe it's very difficult for you to smile at someone, if you force yourself to smile at someone, one, that's just scientifically proven that smiling makes you feel a tiny bit better. So forcing yourself to smile is probably a good idea. But more importantly, when you smile at someone who isn't expecting a smile, suddenly there's this little bit of goodness in the world that didn't exist before, and that wouldn't ever have existed if it weren't for you. You just created that little bit of extra goodness in the world. And it wouldn't have been there if you had taken your own life. So by stalling even for a day, you've proven that you are worth something, that you are someone that we need to have around, that you can create good. So this is just something that I always say to people who are in crisis, and I was so grateful to you for mentioning that smile. That's another good reason to go for a walk, is someone might smile at you unexpectedly, and you're like, okay, you feel a little bit better. Your train of thought is derailed. as Rory very helpfully points out, suicidal thoughts, like all thoughts, they come and go and they change. Now, as for this teenage question, a question which completely I spend so much of my day thinking, worrying about, and I know that Rory does too. It's a really tough one. I will tell you one thing you can do, and I'm a father of 5 myself, is you can let your children know by talking with them openly about suicide and suicidal thinking that you are completely open for them to come to if they are thinking in this way. I don't know if you can do much more than that, but if at a minimum, they can know that you're totally accepting of whatever suicidal thoughts they may be having, whatever depression, whatever anxiety, having, what I now call the suicide talk, I think is really a lot more important these days than having the sex talk. They're probably going to figure the sex stuff out on their own. But the suicide stuff that's out there on the internet right now for teenagers, if you go look at these sites, which I'm not going to talk about, obviously, is terrifying. And so all of us as parents, we really have to let our teenagers and preteens, there's no age, I think, really, when you too young to have this conversation about death and perhaps wanting to take your own life and what it might feel like to want to die. So that much I know we can do, and I'm certain it will help. And as Rory had already pointed out to us, you're not planting a seed by having that conversation. On the contrary, you're putting up a little safety net so they have someone they know they can go to, that they trust and that loves them unconditionally. Sorry, that was too long.
No, that's perfect. And actually, maybe I'll just add to that. Actually, so I agree entirely with that. And so I'll just say a couple of words on that bit, and then I'll do the one about exposure to suicide. So I think for me, I think the most important bit is if a young person has a clear channel of communication with a trusted adult, and that might be you, might be somebody else. So that's the most important thing, I think, about keeping a young person safe. Because again, when you look at the research evidence for the online world and social media and the like, the first thing to note is that there's never one single factor that leads to suicide. And the impact of social media, yes, it can impact on people who are already vulnerable, but the relationship actually is quite small in the whole context of some young person's life. And it's putting that complexity, recognizing that complexity. Now, but what I would say is, again, speaking to people who are suicidal and who are using online worlds, again, you get some people, yeah, there is harms out there, and it's really important. For example, we regulate social media so that some imagery, we regulate dangerous imagery and materials. Now, it's more complicated than just saying that. And the other bit is that there's a lot of hope provided by social media. There's a lot of hope and support. People find their tribe sometimes on social media and the internet more broadly. So we have to be, it's not about closing these things down. It's maximizing safety and security. And yet we can't oversee all the activities of our children. And I have 2 children as well. But it's about making sure that I agree, having that conversation about mental health. It's okay talking about things about these difficult thoughts and difficult issues. But if you have that open channel, that helps. On the question then on the person being exposed to suicide, maybe just one thing just to say on terminology. The term is used there about committing suicide. We try not to talk about committing suicide now because suicide isn't illegal, thankfully, in the United Kingdom and in the United States. But sadly, in too many countries in the world, it still is a crime. And that crime adds to stigma. And we as the International Association for Suicide Prevention are trying to advocate to decriminalize suicide so people get the help and support they need rather than stigma and shame. So we try not, and so people, and I know speaking to loved ones who are bereaved by suicide, sometimes even hearing the phrase committing suicide about their loved one is quite triggering. So even though I think we have to expose people to lots of different terminology, I think we should do whatever we can not to cause offense. So I personally don't use the term committing suicide. I just say died by suicide, ended your life. But yes, the stark reality though is that if somebody who's died by suicide, your risk is elevated. Now, it's important to put that in context, so it's not about scaremongering. That is a statistical increase in risk. It's not a clinical increase in risk in that sense. So although if you know somebody who's died by suicide, your risk is increased, the overwhelming majority of people who are bereaved by suicide will never become suicidal and will never die by suicide. And it's important to say also that holds both for suicides in the family as well as suicides who are close to you. So friendships or colleagues. So it's both that sort of genetic link and the non-genetic link. And what that highlights as well is, again, of course, there are genetic vulnerabilities to poor mental health, but there's no gene for suicide. There's some evidence, of course, that different parts of the genome are associated with vulnerabilities, but it's not an inevitability. It's a vulnerability. And those vulnerabilities are only one small piece, or not small, but a piece of this complex puzzle, which involves genetics, social factors and social context and inequality and discrimination and a whole range of societal factors are probably more important in driving suicide risk than your genetic vulnerability.
There's one other thing I wanted to add just to what Rory said there, and everything I completely agree with, everything that Rory just said. And what I wanted to add was simply that if you have had someone close to you die by suicide, I remember when I was talking to John Draper, who's a fellow who's involved with the 988 and probably a friend of Rory's.
Great guy.
Yeah, wonderful guy. I said, what do you tell people who are survivors of suicide, and who are dealing with this shame? And he said, well, I tell people, survivors who have made attempts and lived, that now you have this superpower. You can talk to other suicidal people with a kind of intimacy of knowledge that others cannot, because they haven't been down this road and in quite the same way. And so all the more reason for you to stay alive, because you can save lives in this particular way. And I want to, of course, say that to those out there who have survived an attempt. But I also think it's really important to hear, for those people who've lost a loved one or a dear friend to suicide, they also now have this superpower of a kind of empathy with the suicidal person and others who've lost loved ones to suicide that might not have existed before. And just listening to Rory's story and the two loved ones he lost to suicide, and his commitment to continue to sort of fight this good fight to try to, this goal that I think most of us in the suicide community believe in, that zero suicide is possible, is an achievable goal, even though it's very far, far away. It really stirs me.
To interrupt, we've just got a lot of still more questions coming in, but I did want to try and move a little bit towards solution with some of this. We've done a lot about recognition, and your book shines such lights on stuff, Rory. I mean, you mentioned something about sleep interruption and deprivation enhances your risk. I mean, this is something I didn't even know. So the stuff that we need to know as parents and as friends, that would raise the alarm perhaps on our minds about other people's behavior. But what I wanted to ask you about was how you start to take action. So Clancy said, go outside, talk to somebody, interact with another living being, even get a dog if you can get a dog. Rory, you have this great list of distracting activities: fishing, yoga, listening to your favorite music. So there's some positive things, but I think everyone would agree that there are things that do not help your state of mind, that conspire with negativity. Someone's written in here about a boyfriend who died by suicide, who was always talking about it. She couldn't take it after a while. She distanced from him, and a week later he died by suicide. So the fact that you want, Rory, you said, for example, I won't mention the site that Clancy mentioned that kids should avoid. There's also the very dark literature. But Rory, you say avoid bars, nightclubs, casinos, environments where drugs are available. And then contrary, you list good places, friends, be around friends, families, acquaintances, social settings like coffee shops, parks, gyms, places of worship, museums, cinemas, libraries. So these are positive
Yeah,
areas.
but Mary, yeah, that's all true. I suppose the way to frame that though is that's about having a safety plan, right? So the point is that what all of those things are parts of a safety plan. And so work developed by Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown in the US, and we've done work on it here in the UK, is so safety plan is a very simple tool in our toolkit, which we hope will stop people crossing the precipice from suicidal thinking to suicidal action. And there are 6 steps. Step 1 is to work collaboratively with somebody who's maybe struggling with their thoughts of suicide to try to identify what the warning signs are that a suicidal crisis might be escalating. And that could be changes in sleep, changes in mood and irritability, or whatever. It's all unique to all of us. So that's step 1. And then, so the point is that once you start to think about the warning signs, then you can it's like an emergency plan. You can then hopefully act earlier so the suicidal crisis doesn't escalate. Now, steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 are about identifying people, places, and organizations and activities that you can do either to distract you when these suicidal thoughts are escalating, or as you move down the steps, so you go down to maybe steps 4 and 5, it's about who you can reach out to in a moment of crisis when you think you can't keep yourself safe. And usually what we try to do in the safety plan is you write down, identify on that safety plan who that would be. And then step 6 is trying to, again, work with individual, again, in a collaborative way so that we can keep their environment safe. Because again, from work that we and others have done, is that the factors that lead you to become suicidal, excuse me, are different from the factors that lead you to act on your thoughts. And a model of suicide that I've developed is basically identifies a group of factors, which are called volitional factors, which increase the likelihood that you'll act on your thoughts. And one of those is having ready access to the means of suicide. So that safety plan, you're trying to maximize the distance between you and your method of potential death. And so that's so when I describe those, going fishing, avoiding the casino, the pubs, and so on, that's for obvious reasons. That pubs, alcohol is a depressant, which that's not going to help you, more likely to be impulsive. So that's about having everybody, in my view, should have a safety plan and have that safety plan with them, either on their phone, in their bag, in their wallet, wherever it may be.
That is so valuable. That is like a survival kit.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
That is really helpful.
And then actually what was really interesting when I was reading Clancy's book is, even though Clancy doesn't formally describe that as, and it goes down to the whole safety planning idea, but everything you describe in the Clancy and your solution is a safety plan. That's what it is. And you've just got your unique safety plan, which you then obviously are trying to get to generalize to others. Yeah,
I tell everyone I talk to about this, they sometimes call them wellness action plans. And yes, you have to start to think about, particularly if you know yourself to be a person who's vulnerable to suicidal thinking, you have to start to take care of your psychological or your spiritual health as seriously as you take care of your physical health, or maybe even more so. And what that's going to look different for every person. A friend of mine who's a great suicidologist, Desiree Elstage, she says the thing that would help her when she was feeling suicidal is she'd go and get a Frappuccino. For me, if there was a time in my life when a 99-cent ice cream cone from McDonald's could be the difference between life and death, I just go get myself. I was feeling like I was right on the edge. I'd go get a McDonald's ice cream cone, and that change of pace and that pleasure from that ice cream cone. But as Rory pointed out, the key to this is being able to recognize, okay, now I'm getting into that space. And yes, I know there are some things that I can do that will work, that will get me out of that place. And I'm willing to go do those things. I need to go do those things now. If you can take that much care for yourself, you will be doing yourself and everyone who loves you such a huge favor. And absolutely 100%, I tell everyone the same thing. You cannot have a gun in the house. I don't care how responsibly you've been interacted with guns throughout your life. You simply cannot keep a gun in the house if you're someone who struggles with suicidal ideation.
Over 50% of suicides are caused by guns in this country. Over 50%, 53%. So
Yeah.
we're going to be dealing with that in the next forum, actually, about gun ownership and if it can ever be healthy.
You have to get that gun out of the house. It's as simple as that. You owe it to yourself and to everyone you love.
So I think a difficult topic for a lot of parents is this troublesome territory when you have teenagers where they often say things, they're trying stuff out. I wouldn't say they're acting out so much, but they're trying behaviors out. And now we're in an era where everything is curated and you're constantly expected to have this entertainment aspect to your life. It's not enough for you to be anymore. You've got to entertain. So it kind of puts pressure on people to go with the clan. I mean, I know you say, Rory, there's these very good support groups, but conversely, there are these very powerful peer groups. So how do parents and friends tell the difference when the teenager's behavior isn't just typical teenage bad behavior? Staying up till 3 a.m, not taking an interest in their appearance, not doing the things, their homework like they used to in the past. How do you know?
Maybe I try that one. There's no easy answer, Mary, is the first thing to say. But what it's about is recognizing that teenage life is really difficult because the brain is still developing and you have this mismatch between emotional processing and cognitive capacity to problem solve. And the adolescent is experiencing all these emotions often for the first time. And that's a real maelstrom and a struggle. And so there will be changes in behavior. And for me, it's very difficult to disentangle in a teenage world that risk-taking behavior, because risk-taking behavior is what we are evolutionarily programmed to engage in adolescence. That's what's about that period in life. Now, so what for me, the question what comes down to is then if you're a parent concerned, you're just trying to understand that sense of, so again, in this model of suicide I've developed, the argument is that people become suicidal when they feel trapped. And that sense of entrapment is often triggered by feelings of defeat and humiliation, which are often also triggered by defeat, humiliation, or defeat, rejection, and loss. So then the question you ask yourself is their experience on the online world, is it contributing to that sense of shame? And then that is concerning. So that's something that you would try and check in with the young person then. But I think what's important to recognize is that, again, comes back to this point about communication, right? So that's why you have to have this line of communication. You have a clear sight of that you will not chastise or judge, but you'll try and understand and validate and recognize that an adolescent is trying, that's what their body is designed to do, is to push these boundaries, and you're trying to keep them safe through that period. And then just one last thing, Clancy probably want to jump in, is it's also important to recognize that suicide risk is rare before puberty, but then the fastest onset of suicide risk is through the adolescent years. And that's when, again, it's to do with this combination of their biology or psychology and their social factors. And then lastly is that we've done a lot of work on social perfectionism, a particular type of perfectionism, which is like, I describe it in my book as, it's like people who are high in social perfectionism are really concerned about what others think and expect of them. So every day is opportunities for repeated failure. And in young and adolescents, that psychological skin is really, really thin, and you're much more likely to be pierced by sort of negative stuff which happens in your online or your offline world. And people who are high in social perfectionism are even more vulnerable.
Wow. There was a lot in that. We're almost out of time, I have to say. Clancy, do you want to have one last quick?
I just wanted to say that for teens and also for anyone else, one, simple technique that we can teach our teens is any kind of, what I use is a 2-minute meditation, any kind of breathing meditation. Teach them that when you're starting to panic, that you can just focus on your breath, listen to your breath for a couple minutes, and remember that you don't have to run away from that suicidal thought. You don't have to act on that suicidal thought. You can hold that suicidal thought like a little baby, let it be there, not be afraid of it, but not act on it, and recognize that it's going to pass like all these other thoughts that you have that come and go. And above all, there's no need for panic. We can teach our teens a simple breathing meditation or a 2-minute meditation, and that too can just save a life, because very often you just have to get people past this point of panic, fight or flight mode.
We've got lots of suicide helplines listed in the chat there. Probably the most recent addition was the 988 suicide line in the United States, texting or phoning. That's a suicide crisis lifeline, 24 hours a day. But there are lots more. And at the end of Rory's book, he lists, I wouldn't say hundreds, but a lot of organizations you can go to, all various different permutations and specialties. So I hope that's been of some help. I've certainly learned a lot. And I hope a lot of people have gotten inspiration and calm and help from hearing both somebody who's walked the road and someone who's spent 25 years or more helping other people walk the road. So thank you for your work, and both the books are worth a read, both of them. So if you can't afford them, get your libraries to order them for you. Okay, so I'd like to thank our two great speakers today for the valuable insight and advice, Professors Clancy Martin and Rory O'Connor. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and you. Thank you all so much for your time and participation. I'll see you then.